My name is David Brown. I am the author of a blog called The Trendy Troodon, and on this channel I have posted intermittently, a lot of the time on Marx, toy soldiers, and figures. I've been waiting to get this video together. This will actually be a second take so I can better organize what I've been meaning to say. What I'll be talking about are the most rare Marx figures I would say I've found so far, possibly the rarest ever, and it's really to the extent that before I got hold of any specimens, was pretty skeptical whether these were actual Marx figures. So here is one of these. It is, you can see pretty clearly, a smaller copy of the Marx Japanese soldiers. And I'll be saying more about that. Here's a Mexican copy of one of the original Marx Japanese soldiers. Now these, I would say, are right up there with the best things Marx ever did. It was either the first wave or still pretty early in their 6-inch or 5 to 6-inch figures. And the big thing that was new, up to that point, they'd mostly done kind of generic toy soldiers. They were based on U.S. Army soldiers or Marines. So kids probably would have just had the same sculpts of soldiers for both sides. What they did was create soldiers for enemy armies, so they had Japanese and German. They also did some of the non-Western or non-American allies, especially they did a Soviet series, which I'm probably going to do a video about. And what I immediately concluded was that this guy is a Marx mold, or at least it was made by people with access to the Marx molds. Now, I'm going to show more before I get into comments. Here's what you can pretty clearly see is an officer. He's got either a katana or just a survival knife. He's got a pistol here and a sheath for the katana or whatever else you would call it. And you can see there's good detail from multiple angles. You can get issues with mold lines, but that's typical for Marx. Here's a Japanese guy with a rifle, and I have one that's similar but not identical. This is another Mexican figure. So it's a similar pose, except this guy's holding his straight. He also has a version here. And you can see there's different sizes bayonets. I'll be getting to that in a little more detail. This has a long bayonet. This still is a Mexican copy, and it has what I've called a shiv bayonet. It's very short, and it's not broken. I have very carefully examined this. They must have altered the mold to make it like this, and they really might have actually made it less safe. I'm going to go ahead and show an original here with this. It's got a long bayonet, but it's very flexible. When I first got it, I was testing it before I had a break appear that I had to fix. So this is very flexible. This because it's harder plastic is a point. And something to note, the original Mark 6-inch are in soft plastic. The recast reissues are more likely to be a hard plastic. Though with these guys, it's a bit different. It is a pretty soft plastic, so things will kind of wobble or bend. There's no sharp points here. And here is one they might have just as soon retired if they had lasted much longer. He's got, I'm not sure how visible it will be on camera, spectacles, which, if you've seen war propaganda, was very much a standard stereotype of the Japanese. They at least didn't otherwise make him unrealistic, so they could say some of them would have had glasses. The knife is unusual. It's not a katana. It really looks like a machete. So probably the Japanese would have issued them, but they would have been actual brush clearing knives. If they'd been in combat, the officers would have had katanas. But what are you going to do? It's a Marx figure. And this is an officer. And I have him in as another Mexican copy. For me, this was just about the very first set of Marx figures I got. I was in a store, a used bookstore. I saw these really big toy soldiers, and then I took a closer look and said, those are Japanese soldiers. So I bought them, and that was the start of my collection. I had one before that was an Indian, but I still count these guys as first. This guy had some damage, I'm sure in part because of the harder plastic. He's missing his finger where he's pointing, and there's a strap of the binoculars that broke off. That was really one of the things that convinced me these are Marx figures. Now, what's interesting about these is just the scale. Now, Marx did figures in a lot of sizes. The ones I've covered before are 4-inch. I did a video on them, and I've also posted on my blog about their 70mm figure. That's usually counted 3-inch, more like 2.8-inch. And it happens to be the same scale as about as a vintage Star Wars figure. Here you can see the guy with Bosk. Here's another one. It's from Tonka. I call him Sidekick Carl because he was part of a superhero mythology I made up as a kid. And here is a Fisher-Price Adventure People figure. Now this is the closest really in proportions, though it's supposed to be a woman. This I saw was supposed to have been made about 1974. So one of the questions here is where these fit in the timeline. It looks like either Marx was experimenting with the 3.75-inch scale ahead of the action figures, or it might be that when the action figures like this started coming out, that they retooled their older figures to scale down to something that would be compatible with the action figures. And one more thing that is significant to note, there had been the Army Men style of figures in 3.75-inch before. Here is one from Archer, and you can see she's about the same height as the Japanese officer, though you can see even this woman is more, you could say, robust than this figure. And that was definitely a consequence of them being scaled down. At 6 inches, its natural proportions. Uh, when you scale down, you get uh, things that look skinnier compared to action figures or other army men figures. But as far as I've been able to tell, these scaled down figures were the only figures Marx did or might have done that were at the 3.75 inch scale. Now, that gets to where I would say these are very rare. And the main thing here is that there is a spectrum. Now, there are figures Marx made that are either rare or expensive now. This is an example of an expensive figure. This is a 6-inch figure from a Marvel line. It's supposed to be Daredevil, and you can see there's major condition issues. A hand broke off, his horns are gone. There was supposed to be a billy club here. That was long gone when I got it. And what you can see from this was about the average price for a Mark 6-inch figure, and this is what the condition issues were to get it down to that kind of price. But the thing about these, there's really nothing to indicate Marx made any fewer of these than other lines, at least for an initial release. They might have been in production a shorter time than other 6-inch figures, especially the ones where Marx made the original molds. With licensing a product, there's always a risk you're going to lose the license after a short time, but pretty clearly the main reason these are so expensive now is that there's higher demand than there even would have been at the time. And another one that's very rare, actually rare, is the Campus Cuties line. This is one that I bought from someone who had hand painted them or acquired them from someone who had. These are really up there with the Japanese figures as far as the quality. And it's done as civilian figures in sort of 50s or 60s fashion. And what's complicated about these is that there were 2 releases. The first release is what this is a part of, the rather series, and they are not that expensive. The prices go a little higher if it's original. There are also reissues. You might have a little trouble telling which is which, but it really doesn't make that big a difference in price. But the second series they did apparently was a much more limited release, and nobody has found the molds yet, if we ever will. And that's very unfortunate. From the pictures I've seen of these, the second series really was among the best Marx ever did, and they made what would have been a bit more modern dress, like women in jeans or slacks, but they are hard to find, and even not something you would find at all. And this is the difference. With the Marvel figures, they're expensive, but you can find them listed. With the second series of Canvas Cuties, you will not even find them in the usual channels. I can confirm some of them have been auctioned, but they're very, very few, and probably by professional antique sellers, not just people who would be selling things on eBay or other online auctions. Now, then the gray area is what is a proper Marx release. Now, one of the categories you'll deal with is that there were people doing copies, knockoffs of Marx figures while the company was in operation. Uh, and here's an example. This is a Marx Megatherium, the giant ground sloth. This is one that was made by MPC. This is a recast. If anything, an original MPC might be more valuable than this. There are differences you can see, especially on the inside of the paws. Some differences where MBC was cutting a few corners, but overall, there's not really a big difference in quality. They're both good vintage figures. It's obvious MBC copied Marx, but then there were plenty of times Marx copied other people, probably including MBC. And I'll say this once: Marx, MBC are not the same company. Stop putting Marx and MBC in an online listing for a single figure. Now, the real gray area from there, you get into recasts and reissues, which is what these are. And the thing about this is that you don't have to worry about people trying to fool you. Even if people have no idea what they're doing, they don't pretend to believe that things are what they aren't. And I think there's a few further reasons for that. One, with Marx figures, you are dealing with mature, even professional collectors. There's people like me who got into it as adults, so we know what we're doing and we know where to look things up. Another is, just as I've mentioned, that there isn't that big a difference in price between a recast and original. Something like this that Marx made probably for a long time might go for about 10 or 20 if it's a bit rarer. A reissue set like this would also go for 20, maybe 30 if it's something rare like this. And even with this set I got, it was only a little over 20. Now, the real gray area from there are things that are technically Marx, but you really can't easily say that they were Marx releases. The two big ones, there is a Superman figure they did, and they did an actual nude figure. It was going further in from the Campus Cuties. These could be a little bit, you might say, provocative. They did some others, what they called the Bathing Beauties, that were risque. With the nude figure, it was pretty much a gag or a internal promotion. They made a few that were circulated privately and very discreetly to adults, but there was never any question of them being put on the market. And with those, pretty much anything you will see on the market is going to be a reissue. And again, if people are remotely honest, they're going to say that. The originals would really be on par with a rocket-firing Boba Fett, though probably still not the same amount of expense or demand. If people say it's a reissue or reproduction, you're fine. If they say it's original, but they aren't charging a very, very high price, then they probably either are lying or they just don't know what they're doing. Now, with these, I could see this going either way. Now, the tricky thing here, I have two sets of these. I was only prepared to show these Japanese figures. The other is a set of Nazi figures, so the obvious thing is just on the other side of where Marx was before they did the enemy figures. Where is the other side that they're supposed to fight? And what I would hypothesize is that Marx was going to do a release of their U.S. Army figures in this size. They might have also planned to do the Soviet figures. They might have done it. They probably would have if these were in fact sold. But so far I would say we do not know. Now with these, as far as why Marx would have done this size and these figures, my guess is that they were considering it an experiment and they were starting with something that might not have done as well the first time. Any collector like me will love these guys, but they were Marx going out on a limb and it might not have worked at the time. The kids they were selling to were already used to just generic army figures, so if they wanted figures to play with, they probably wouldn't have cared about having these guys either way. They might have bought them, they might not have. Now, a further report about these things from the person who sold these to me, both of the sets I have, is that they were sold pre-painted. Now, that was something Marx did sometimes. There were other times, like with the Canvas Cuties, that they sold figures that were meant to be painted later. But we don't really know. So if these were sold that way, I think it's a bit more likely that they were aiming for just a different market, like adult collectors. But that, again, is just a hypothesis, assuming that the report is correct. And they might also have hoped that that would make these a little more intercompatible with the new action figures, whether it was Fisher-Price, Tonka, Kenner, whatever. And that really is about as far as we can get with the information at hand. What I really think is most likely is that these never really got past the experimental phase. And again, you can see the possibilities with what we can prove about the rocket-firing Boba Fett. That was an experiment by the company that never got into mass production. They might have made 50 to 100 of them, and those, of course, are now astronomically expensive. And that's the kind of thing where if someone says they're selling an original, either they're lying or they stole it, which has happened. Yes. Now, with these, given that it's an experiment, there's still different points it could have gone to. So we can prove at least that Marx got far enough to have molds for at least 2 sets of figures. And that is farther than you get with the ones that were strictly one-time experiments, like the Superman or the nude figure. So probably they did go further and produce some of these, and even if that was just a trial run, more likely than not, they would at least have sold what they made in stores. But beyond that, I think it's very clear that this was at best a very short-lived experiment. And there's still the question, are the Japanese and the Nazis all they made or sold, or did they get far enough to sell American or Soviet figures? With that, right now, we don't know, and there's a very real chance we will never know. But we do have these. Now, if you want to know whether to buy them, if you want a complete or at least representative Marx figures collection, these are very worthwhile. Again, they're the intermediate between the 4-inch size that Marx did make and the smaller figures like the 2.8-inch figures. But for overall aesthetic appeal, you're really much better getting a 6-inch figure. With these, there is some loss of detail here. I think, if anything, it's more visible on the other set of figures, which I'm not showing yet for the Nazis. And here, I think, are the two figures that show it most. You have this guy for the officer around his mouth. You can maybe see some issues with the mold, but it's all realistic and not stereotyped. Here, to me, there's just significantly less detail in just that part. So that is also a potential consideration in whether Marx did these. Or if one more middle ground option, they might have approved the experiment but had someone else do it. They had factories in Mexico, in the UK. They even had factories making their figures in the Soviet Union, what's now Ukraine. Those I'm probably going to give their own video. So overall, it's interesting. It's worth getting if you are a collector. But overall, there are better Marx figures out there. And we definitely need to know more. If anyone has any of these in this size, start posting pictures of it. Contact me. Contact the other sites like Marx Wild West. Get the word out about what these things were like, and if you're old enough, who you really can remember buying them from. So for now, I'm going to call it a day and sign off for now. And I will definitely be following this up.